I've been talking up till now primarily about climate change, so I want to shift gears now and talk about the international politics of energy. Because it's a different kind of international environmental issue. It's a natural resource issue where there's a limited supply. So in the case of greenhouse gases, the problem is we have too much of them, right? And we're poisoning the atmosphere. In the case of energy, right, it's stuff that is in finite supply. Every time we use it up, there's less of it there to be used in the future, and that creates its own kind of issues, right? So rather than being we've got too much of something problem, it's a problem that there's a scarcity of something, and the political dynamics are a little bit different. The connection, of course, oddly enough, is that when we burn that energy, which is so valuable, we make climate change worse. So let's just say a little bit about the global hydrocarbon economy. It shapes economic development, both because people use the fuel to produce things and to live their lives, but also, of course, people make a lot of money selling this stuff and processing it. It leads, therefore, to relationships of dependence and power in terms of who's got the stuff and who needs the stuff. The prices create, and fluctuations in prices create vulnerabilities. And lastly, then, there seems to be a potential connection between energy and conflict. So I want to discuss that. So let's just talk about energy and economic development. It would seem like a very difficult thing in life to be in a country that doesn't have any oil or natural gas, because then you've got to buy it from others and you're dependent on them. And that's true. The flip side of that is it seems like, therefore, it must be an awesome thing to have big supplies of oil and natural gas. But that actually can be a curse. And in fact, there is a term in the literature known as the natural resource curse. Why are natural resources a curse? Well, in part because when natural resources, and oil in particular, are a big part of an economy, they distort the economy in a way that makes it hard for other elements of the economy to develop. And essentially, and this is what's sometimes known as the Dutch disease, which is what happened to the Netherlands economy, which was a very healthy economy, and an advanced economy, but after oil was discovered in the North Sea. And essentially what happened was the Dutch had a nice, healthy economy. They started pumping oil out of the North Sea, and so more money all of a sudden was flowing into the Dutch economy, but it was flowing into one sector. So what's the effect of all that money in the Dutch economy? Well, the answer is it drove the prices of everything up. It drove the value of the Dutch currency up, which meant Dutch exports now were very expensive in other places. So while the oil industry was booming, the economic effects on inflation and on the Dutch currency were such that it made people who were not involved in that part of the Dutch economy much, much, much worse off. And so in a way, a booming oil economy tends to kill other parts of the economy and lead to imbalance. The other thing, interestingly enough, is that in the Netherlands, actually here is an exception, but there's a pretty strong correlation between countries that rely heavily on energy in their economies and a lack of democracy. And the reasons are debated. Part of it is that if you have lots of money, it's easy to sort of buy people off, provide people with things, and so authoritarians can use that to remain popular. But it's also the case, it seems, that when there's lots of natural resources in a country, politics really becomes about capturing access to those resource flows so that you can skim off some money and get rich. And that seems to drive autocracy rather than democracy. A last question that I want to ask is, what happens if and when we actually do deal seriously with climate change, and when we really stop or dramatically reduce consumption of our hydrocarbons? What happens in the producing economies then? And that's a question that we should think about. So how does energy create power? Well, if you're producing energy and selling it to others, and if their economy is dependent on it, then you can threaten them or coerce them by saying, if you don't do what we like, we're going to stop sending you the stuff. And the famous case of this was in 1973, when because the Arab states that produce much of the oil consumed in the West were angry with the West over its support for Israel in the Arab-Israeli conflict, they simply said, we're going to enact an embargo. We're going to stop selling oil to you. And that not only led to the first really big energy crisis in the West, but it led to a massive economic recession in most of the advanced world because with the price of energy hugely rising, all of a sudden all kinds of economic activities became more expensive, and therefore people just did less of them. And I can tell you, when I was a kid, there was such a shortage of gasoline in the United States that there were lines of cars, blocks and blocks long, waiting to get what little gas was available at a station on a given day. It was something to see. More recently, Russia has, in several cases, cut off the supply of natural gas to Ukraine as a way of forcing Ukraine to concede on any number of issues. And related to that, then, is the fact that much of Western Europe's energy comes from natural gas that flows through pipelines that originate in Russia. And that gas is coming out of the ground in Russia. And so as one of the big fears that a lot of people have is either that Russia will cut off Europe from gas and if Europe doesn't do what Russia wants, or that Europe will make a bunch of big concessions to Russia because Europe is afraid of its reliance on Russian gas. So in that sense, that's a big power asset for Russia in its relations with Western Europe. At the same time, its reliance on energy exports makes the Russian economy vulnerable in its own way. So just as an increase, a spike in energy prices can all of a sudden take a healthy economy and drive it into recession, which has happened several times for the United States, the opposite can happen as well, which is rapid declines in the price of energy can all of a sudden lead to real economic problems in the countries that rely on selling this stuff. So because the price of oil and gas internationally tends to boom and bust, I won't get into the reasons why, but it tends to boom and bust, there's a natural instability and sort of a repetition of crisis that tends to result. Just to give you an idea, here's what the global price of oil has done between 1950 and 2020. And, overall, there's been kind of a trend towards increases, but you can see it is incredibly volatile. And there's a whole school of thought that says that this graph actually explains a lot of the political disruptions we see in the world. For example, gas, the price of oil essentially peaked right around 1979 at the time of the Iranian Revolution, which took a lot of energy off the global market. And then it declined through the 1980s. And there are those who believe that ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union, for all the political causes, was actually caused, or at least in part caused, by a collapse in energy prices, which just really created immense problems for the Soviet economy. That's a speculation or a theory or a hypothesis, not proven, but it's worth pointing out. And there's a whole sort of theory that says that the popularity of the governments in resource-selling countries goes up and down with the price of oil. The big point I want to make at is these things are closely tied to politics because oil prices shape economic boom and bust, and economic booms and busts shape politics. So this brings us to the question of energy in conflict. And over the past 100 years or so or more, it seems that war, in some cases, is directly about access to raw materials, and especially about oil, or sometimes it seems indirectly related. So let's just talk about World War II. Germany was probably headed east in World War II one way or the other because of the nature of Hitler, but where it went and how was driven largely by the fact that Germany did not have much of its own oil. So first it went into Romania, where there's some oil along the Black Sea coast, and then Germany's push towards the Caspian Sea, which led it towards its fatal turning point battle at Stalingrad, was really driven by Germany's shortage of oil. Similarly, in World War II, Japan does not have a lot of its own oil or natural resources, and so a lot of Japan's drive to colonize Southeast Asia was driven by the need to gain access to supplies of raw materials. But of course, the French had colonized that, the British were there, And it really was that expansion that drove Japan into war with Britain and the United States. There are those who would argue that the United States' involvement in Iraq, first in 1991 and again after 2003, really in the end was mostly about controlling the Iraqi oil supply. So there's really two opposite kinds of questions that we think might lead to instability. One is, what happens if supplies begin to run out? Will we see countries relying more on the use of force to gain supply, to gain access or control of the supplies of oil that they're dependent on? The flip side is, what happens if we actually do go to alternative sources of energy, and so we don't need to buy so much oil anymore? What happens to all those countries whose economies have been highly dependent on oil? Those are questions I'm not going to answer right now, but they're very important ones.